Hey guys, what's up? It's Clay. Welcome back to another video. So today I'm going to talk about INFJs and this feeling of being misunderstood. If you don't know what an INFJ is, it is one of the 16 personality types according to MBTI. So if you don't know what that is, you could go do some research. You can do one of the tests, try to figure out your personality. If you happen to be an INFJ, then come back and have a listen. That being said, this video is about feeling misunderstood, and there's other personalities, probably lots of different types of people that also feel misunderstood. I'm gonna sort of target it towards the INFJs, but of course, lots of other people might get something out of this. So what I've noticed is that INFJs almost universally feel misunderstood oftentimes, in their families, their relationships, friendships. It's a really funny thing. It's something that I have massively struggled with in my past. And another thing that I've noticed about INFJs is that oftentimes we have trauma in our pasts. Every INFJ that I know in real life has some kind of traumatizing experience that they've been through. I mean, it could be that all people have trauma, and I'm just using cognitive bias to notice that INFJs have trauma. So I actually asked this question to my friend Joyce, and so she does videos. I actually went on her YouTube channel one time, but I asked her this question. Do you think it's possible that INFJs are kind of born out of trauma? Or it's almost like we're created out of some kind of traumatizing experience. And she had this interesting response. She said, is it that INFJs were born out of trauma, or is it just that INFJs, because of their nature, just end up in traumatizing situations because they're so misunderstood or so different in some way? So I thought that was a really interesting answer, and it got me thinking about that. So really quick, INFJs, introverted intuition dominant, secondary extroverted feelers, personality junkie. I like their names for these things. They call the NI, or the introverted intuition, they call it perspectives. The ability to consider all these perspectives, think outside the box, look at things and kind of form these conclusions. The second thing they call extroverted feeling, they call harmony. So it's this desire to have harmony in our relationships, to care for others, to support other people. In the end, it makes INFJs very interested in people, very interested in decoding people. So what I've noticed about the introverted intuitive dominance, so that's INFJ, INTJ. Because of this intuitive process that is sort of the dominant function, quite often INTJs, INFJs are kind of thinking outside the box. They're coming to all these random conclusions. They're putting together all these puzzles. And to be honest, sometimes they might be telling people things that they just don't want to hear. I think the difference between INFJs and INTJs is that INTJs don't really seem, I could be wrong about this. I'm not an INTJ. They're kind of a mystery to me, to be honest. And to be honest, sometimes I feel really pissed off by INTJs. It's like this love-hate relationship I have with INTJs. But it seems to me, from my perspective, that INTJs it's almost like they don't care what people think about them as much as INFJs. They don't really care that they're misunderstood. They're perfectly fine just moving on with their day after somebody doesn't understand them, unless there's something on the line. But INFJs seem more bothered, more depressed by this feeling of being misunderstood. INFJs, I think, crave connection with people. But in this process of trying to find connection, often leaves them feeling misunderstood, which creates this sort of loneliness feeling. And so it's something that I've noticed about a lot of INFJs I've met, is that they are amazing people. They're doing amazing things, but then there's this underlying almost sadness that can kind of exist in that personality. And I think that sadness is almost built upon that feeling of craving connection but not being able to truly get it. So feeling misunderstood is a horrible feeling. I feel like it's tolerable as long as you have somebody in your life that understands you. I feel like at this point in my life with my partner Lexi, who's also an INFJ, we spend probably like 2 or 3 hours a day talking about all kinds of random things, which sounds like torture to certain people, I'm sure. But for me, it's sort of like food for the soul. We we get to know each other on such a deep level, and I really enjoy having this one deep connection in my life. It's something that's, I find, super fulfilling. But there was a time in my life where I didn't have that. And I think that almost feels like a bit of like a starvation. It's this desire for connection, but not finding it. And then it's exasperated by being around people that, not only don't understand you, but almost misunderstand you. So I want this video to be encouraging. And I was trying to think, how do you fix being misunderstood? How do you solve this situation? I feel like I have moved from a state, in the past of feeling very misunderstood, feeling very depressed, almost near suicidal at times. I've slowly moved through that. And while my life is not perfect and I have all kinds of problems still, I have solved a few of these underlying problems. And I wanted to try to think if there's some kind of step-by-step process to kind of work through to hopefully fix it. So for the remainder of this video, I'm going to talk about things that are trying to get to the goal of feeling understood. How can you move from a state of feeling misunderstood into a state of at least feeling some semblance of people understand me or somebody understands me? I'm not an alien. I'm part of the world. All right, so step one is to deprioritize people who misunderstand you consistently. And to be honest, I realize that all these relationships are so hard. And how do you deprioritize a relationship that's supposed to be very important? To be honest, I'm not sure. It's sort of one of those catch-22s. But I also feel like in order to move along this process of feeling understood and seeking understanding, you have to deprioritize people that are never going to get you. And in some ways, it doesn't have to be a negative thing. It can be like a release. It can be like you've been holding that breath, just let it out and just accept. This person is likely never going to get me, so I'm just going to take a step back and just breathe a little bit. I'm going to stop trying so hard. So along those same lines is to deprioritize people who make you feel invisible. There are certain people, it's like they don't even want to understand you. They're doing their own thing, and it's almost like they see you as an accessory to their mission. I think this might happen more with women than men. So there's this kind of underwritten cultural norm, right? That, two people get married, let's say a man and a woman, and it's, the cultural standard is that the man goes and gets a job, and it's sort of almost like a priority is given to that person's life. And it's almost like there's this risk of the woman in that situation almost becoming an accessory to the man's success, the man's vision, the man's mission. Just that for an INFJ, if you are in a situation where you're almost like an accessory, that's not going to be healthy. I think that INFJs need their own mission and purpose. They need their own things to work towards. So moving on to my third thing here, and we're going to start talking about vulnerability. So what my theory is, what my hypothesis is that vulnerability is the solution to misunderstanding. So I realize that doesn't sound very concise at this point. That kind of sounds vague, right? But I'm going to go into it here. So vulnerability, what is that? That is sharing yourself, sharing your wants, needs, desires, just being open in areas that you want to be open. That's what vulnerability is. Basically what I do on these videos is me practicing vulnerability. So I heard quite a while ago, it was James Altucher on his podcast. He was talking about kind of the secret to his success. And he's an interesting person, mainly because he sort of has made it from rags to riches multiple times. So, he started off kind of poor and unsuccessful and made tens of millions of dollars, had everything, and then lost it all. And he was down to $100 again. And then he rebuilt all the way again. And I think he might have done this 2 or 3 times. And I think now he's successful again. But it's an interesting story because it's a person who's literally gone from the bottom to the top multiple times. And one of his ideas on what creates success, at least in the case of any type of thing where you're sharing things, like say you're a writer, or you make videos, or music, or really it could be anything. It could be business. What is the solution? What is the secret? And he says it's vulnerability. And what is vulnerability? Vulnerability is sharing yourself. So one thing I've noticed about INFJs is they're very private and guarded. And it takes a while of knowing an INFJ to really unpack all the layers. They're almost like onions. So my current partner, Lexi, also INFJ, I mean, we knew each other for about 7 or 8 years before we were officially in a romantic relationship. And it took me years to slowly unpeel the layers of her. So naturally, INFJs I think are guarded, and they might even have these layers of vulnerability that kind of come off over time. And I think that INFJs also have this tricky ability to appear vulnerable sometimes, even when they're not. It's like they have their few stories they can share to make people think they're being vulnerable, when really they're not, or they're still keeping or hiding their core from people. So I think the reason why being vulnerable as an INFJ is uncomfortable is it's like you get that overshare feeling. And it's another thing I've noticed about INFJs. Almost all of them experience this. We end up in these social situations. We want connection. Sometimes we might say a little too much. And the other person's probably fine with it. But for us, it's like we went too deep into the onion. We said something that we shouldn't have said, and then it's like this anxiety after the fact, and you might wake up the next day and just be like, oh, why did I say that? Like I said too much. So so the interesting thing about that is vulnerability. The feeling of oversharing is the result of being vulnerable. So my third thing here, my third step on going down this road to getting rid of misunderstanding in your life is you have to get used to vulnerability. You have to get to practice vulnerability in some ways. And so what I've noticed is that the first time you share something, let's say you've just got something inside, and I know a bunch of INFJs, and all the INFJs have these things inside of them. It's like the things that they like, things that they want to do, ideas that they have. They might have some very countercultural ideas, but they don't share them with anybody for fear of judgment. So it's that fear of judgment. It's like the fear of being vulnerable. The first time you share something, it can trigger that overshare feeling. It can trigger that, post-sharing anxiety. And so a lot of people don't really start. And so the process is to step out, share something, even if it's anonymous. And so here's what I've noticed is that you can create these anonymous personas on the internet. And then you can share things. Like, let's say you could make some type of art, or you could have some kind of conversation, or you can go on Twitter and just create an anonymous account and start sharing your ideas. I actually think this is a really healthy process because it gets you used to the feeling of sharing that side of you that you would normally maybe hide out of fear of judgment. And you don't have the same oversharing feeling because it's anonymous in a way. So this is my first step. Practice sharing even if it's anonymous. So the next step is you want to almost trigger that overshare feeling. Why would you want to overshare? Why would you want to trigger that? That's crazy, right? There's so much anxiety in that overshare feeling. I really do believe there's some kind of an exposure therapy. Like the first time you admit something to somebody, it feels so scary. Maybe the second time is a little less scary. That's sort of my point, right? So it's like, why is something oversharing? It's because it's secret in a way, right? So I've had these kinds of things in my life where it's almost like this desire to keep things secret. For example, I've met INFJs who have grown up as a Christian, and they still are in a Christian community, and everybody, for all intents and purposes, still thinks they're a Christian, but they're not. They're an atheist. And they sort of confess that to me, and it's like nobody else knows it, not even their own families. So that's an example, right? You've got this authenticity problem. On the inside, you're one thing, but on the outside, you're putting forward this front. And I think that's a very exhausting thing to uphold. I've talked to people who have certain needs and desires in their relationships, but they aren't able to voice those to their partner. They're not even able to say they want it in the first place. They can't even get to the point of actually getting it because they can't even admit it. So the reason why I think vulnerability is so important is that you can never be understood until you are vulnerable. That's the problem. If you keep everything inside, you will sort of go through life with this misunderstood feeling just by default because nobody is even given the chance to fully see you and to understand you. So as you become more vulnerable, these interpersonal problems are going to pop up. People aren't going to like what you're saying. People aren't going to like what you're doing. People aren't going to like what you're making. You might get some bad comments. And it's really interesting. When I first started this YouTube channel, it was a perfect example. It was almost like me practicing vulnerability. And in the beginning, I remember just the slightest negative comment would just bother me so much. It would almost destroy me. I could be like depressed for hours after this one negative comment. It's so funny to think about now because now I get lots of negative comments. I get lots of negative messages and it really doesn't bother me. It almost bounces off me. I mean, sometimes now and then, something that's really pointed or offensive might bother me. But even if something does bother me, it doesn't bother me for a long time. I've gotten used to the fact that as I'm vulnerable, some people won't like it. So here's an example. The very first MBTI video I made, I think it's called Being an INFJ. I made that video, I posted it up. It was shortly after my separation. I had somebody in my real life, send me this really angry email about that video. Like, what are you doing? Like, what are you even doing right now? Making videos about MBTI? Like, get your head on straight, basically. And they saw me being vulnerable on the internet and talking about what I wanted to talk about as almost insulting. Needless to say, that person is no longer in my life. But it was an interesting point. As I took a step forward, this person was upset. I think the people that truly have your back won't do that to you. It's almost a good test. It's like, do some stuff that is authentically you. And do people get irrationally upset with you? Or do they kind of, come alongside you? So I'll give you another quick example. So before my whole marriage fell apart, there's a number of reasons why that happened. I've been tempted to do a video on it because I have people ask me now and then, and I've learned so many things. Now I'm in this co-parenting relationship 50-50, and there's just been so much stuff that's happened. But, as I said before, I've always enjoyed photography. So my ex-wife's family always hated my photography. They hated that I took pictures of women. I would take pictures of men too. They didn't like the context of it. They didn't like the idea that I was out there taking pictures or finding beauty or appreciating beauty in people other than my wife. That really bothered them. And one time they staged this intervention to kind of tell me this, basically. And so these are the kinds of things that are going to happen as you step out and do your thing. If I didn't do my art, then I wouldn't have had this interpersonal conflict happen. What I'm trying to say is that it's an important part of the process to deal with these personal conflicts as they come up, because guaranteed, as you become more vulnerable, these are the kind of things that are going to happen. So I'm finally getting to the point of all this, and it's something that I've really noticed. So as you step out in vulnerability, you put yourself out there. Let's say, just like these videos, I put myself out there. Or on Instagram, I put out my photography and my video work that I do. Or it could even just be putting my ideas out and putting my thoughts out there into the world. There will be people that kind of come out of the woodworks in your area of vulnerability. I can't tell you how many times it's happened where, let's say I put something a little too honest on Instagram. Like, I've kind of got a habit with Instagram of just dumping all my thoughts into my Insta stories. And, sometimes I think it comes off a little negative, and people sometimes think that, I'm not doing well. And, because I'm sort of just unleashing my thoughts sometimes, or on Twitter. I actually don't have a lot of followers on Twitter. I almost feel somewhat anonymous on there. but I'll still put my ideas. One thing that I've noticed is that I've made some really good connections with people that I wouldn't have made if I wasn't vulnerable. And so this is the key to the entire story. So other than my kids, the most important relationship in my life right now is with my partner, Lexi. It's been such an amazing experience finding this deep connection and knowing that that's possible. I think a lot of people, especially INFJs, don't actually think it's possible. They don't think it's possible to find that. I mean, I have found that in her, and I find it amazing. How did we meet? We met on a photo shoot. She was modeling and I was doing the photos. You know, that was me stepping out, and then this connection was formed. I've got multiple examples of this. I might put my thoughts out on Instagram, and then an old friend that I haven't talked to since I was like 15 years old all of a sudden messages me, and there's this connection there. There's this thing that we have in common that I never knew about. And I don't think I would have known that we have that thing in common if I wouldn't have put my thoughts out there and experienced that vulnerable feeling. So yeah, it's funny, when I think about some of the closest relationships in my life now, I can actually trace them back to the results of being vulnerable. And a lot of the old frivolous relationships in my life have kind of just fallen away. It's just sort of happened naturally. So in the process, the depth of those relationships is so much more robust. They were formed on top of similar ideas in a way. And through that process, I've found people that can understand me. And so that is why I've kind of correlated these two things. It's being vulnerable, going through this process that is somewhat uncomfortable and awkward, to forming new relationships, and then solving that misunderstanding feeling with new people that can't understand you. So it's a difficult process to get from the beginning of that to the end. But that's why I think that vulnerability, it's like the key to the door. And so that's not to say that after you find some people that can understand you, that solves all your problems. I still have lots of problems in my life. But one thing that I think is a lot better than it used to be is I don't have that deep, misunderstood feeling like I used to. And I don't know, I just got this feeling with INFJs that feeling of being misunderstood causes a lot of problems. Depression and anxiety, existential crisis. And it's so funny, like as an introvert, for me sometimes to admit, like, yes, I crave aloneness sometimes, but yet community is so important to my health. So anyway, guys, hopefully that wasn't too disjointed, but I wanted to sort of share this process that vulnerability, I think, is so important, and I think we need to practice it, and we need to practice the feelings that come up from being vulnerable. Because I honestly think it's like exposure therapy. You can get used to it. And I think it can improve your life. Anyway, if you have any thoughts about that, put it in the comments, any questions. I always appreciate hearing from people. And otherwise, I hope you guys are doing well. See you later.